We are with a cyber expert, among other things. Dr. Amy Zegart has been an expert on U.S. intelligence, emerging technologies, and national security, grand strategy, and global political risk management for decades. And she joins us from Northern California, where she is the Morris Arnold and Nona Jean Cox Senior Fellow at the Hoover Institution, where she directs the National Security Affairs Fellows Program. She's also a Senior Fellow at the Freeman Spogli Institute of International Studies and a Professor of Political Science at Stanford. Her book is Spies, Lies, and Algorithms, the key word there, because it's the technological era we're in that has transformed the intelligence landscape. And that's why we've invited Amy to talk to us. I just want to mention that in her acknowledgement section, she really goes into what this career has meant by saying 6 moves, 6 books, 3 kids, 7 high maintenance pets, and a single husband who she claims when she met him was winning the lottery. And I have no doubt with that career, it is Amy. You've had a considerable career in public service in addition to your academic career. And I just want to highlight that you were on the Clinton administration's National Security Council team staff and a foreign policy advisor to the Bush 2000 presidential campaign. So your bipartisan cred is great with us also, which we value very much at the World Affairs Councils of America. So thank you for joining us today.
Well, thank you, Bill, so much for inviting me to be a part of the World Affairs Council cover to cover. And I so love your mission, the bipartisan mission, the bringing people together to talk about international affairs. It's a real honor to be with you.
I'd like to get started, Amy, by talking about the 3 challenges you identify as converging, because we've seen technological advance before in this country as it affects national security, but this time apparently is different. So please tell us what those 3 challenges are, and we'll get into it.
So, Bill, one of the things about writing a book is, your thinking always changes. So I've moved from 3 to 5. So I'll give you my 5. Okay. So, as we think about emerging technologies, things like the internet, AI, quantum computing, commercial satellite imagery, all of these things are converging, and they're creating what I call the 5 mores for intelligence. And briefly put, the first more is more threats, right? So think about cyberspace. You mentioned cyber at the very beginning. So more countries can do more things to us in cyberspace across vast distances. That's a challenge for our intelligence agencies. The second more is more speed. Intelligence has to move at the speed of relevance, and that is accelerating dramatically. And so I often talk about how if we were talking about intelligence in the Cold War, the Cuban Missile Crisis, John F. Kennedy had 13 days between the time we had that intelligence of what the Soviets were up to in Cuba and when he had to make his decision. Today, we have more like 13 minutes or 13 seconds, or maybe we're too late because cyber bad actors are in our networks for weeks or months before we know what they're doing. So that speed of decision-making is a huge challenge driven by technology. So more threats, more speed. The third more data. Intelligence analysts are drowning in a sea of data, which is doubling about every 2 years. The fourth more customers, people who don't have security clearances who need intelligence. So voters need intelligence about foreign threats to our election. Tech leaders need intelligence about cyber threats. So more people need intelligence that don't have security clearances and work in government offices. And then there's the fifth more, which is perhaps the most radical more for intelligence, which is more competitors. So intelligence isn't just for spy agencies anymore. And we're seeing this playing out in Ukraine in real time. Open source intelligence. Anybody with an internet connection can collect information, produce information, analyze information. And so what we see is this burgeoning world of open source intelligence, individuals and organizations that are transforming the competitive landscape of where information comes from and how it's delivered.
Can anybody really analyze intelligence? What is intelligence and what is analysis? These are 2 basic questions.
Anyone can try, but doing it well is another matter. So it's such a good question. Intelligence is more complicated than it seems. And intelligence, the simplest definition of intelligence, is information that gives policymakers decision advantage. And by decision advantage, I mean understanding what's happening in the world better and faster than adversaries do. So it could be decision advantage about something near term. What's Putin going to do next in Ukraine? It could be decision advantage over something long term. What's the likely longevity of the Chinese Communist Party? And so lots of information can provide decision advantage, but you're right, analysis and information, or analysis and intelligence, are not the same. And so the same piece of information can mean very different things depending on the context and depending on who's analyzing it. So we tend to think of intelligence as a crystal ball, right? Or a smoking gun. Pick your metaphor. We know it when we see it. But the reality is it's often much fuzzier than that. So for example, with troop movements on the border of Ukraine, we had incontrovertible evidence that there were Russian troops moving near the border. But what that information, what that intelligence couldn't tell you was, what did Putin intend to do? That required analysis. What are the odds that he's bluffing? What are his goals? What's his state of mind? What are his intentions? And Vladimir Putin may not have even known until the moment he decided to invade. But that's where the analysis comes in, interpreting that information and looking at alternative explanations.
Technique and strategy. Since we've already gotten to Russia, Ukraine, I'm going to stay there, but I will ask a couple of questions. And then I should say, we already have more than 20 questions that were pre-submitted by a variety of our members and supporters. And I would invite this virtual audience to also contribute questions via the chat box or the Q&A box, and I will try to get to all of them. So Amy, in your 5 challenges, the mores, there seems to be less of one thing, which is secrecy. And I want you to touch on that with a view. Let's link it up to Ukraine, because the US did something, and partners, UK and others, did something very interesting with, setting the table in a way by revealing the intelligence they had that showed what Putin was up to. And that took away some of that decision advantage, it seems, for Moscow.
Absolutely. I'm so glad, Bill, that you raised this issue of secrecy. We're seeing a dramatic transformation in intelligence. And a key part of what's changing is we can't be as secret as we used to be. Secrecy doesn't confer the same advantage that it used to. And I think the Biden administration has developed a really new strategy about revealing information. We have never seen this much intelligence with this much specificity being revealed in real time. Never, right? I mean, it's just a steady drumbeat of intelligence that's being declassified. That's a big deal. Intelligence agencies always want to keep those collection streams close, because when you reveal it, you may lose it, right? And so I think there are really 3 reasons why the administration is doing it. Reason number 1, inoculation. This is information warfare. The Russians are pros at deception. And when you reveal that kind of granular intelligence, Biden was basically saying to the world, with the help of his intelligence agencies, don't believe the con you're about to hear coming out of the Kremlin. So the truth got out of the gate before the lie. And that was, I think, incredibly helpful in rallying the allies and rallying the domestic populations of the United States and abroad to really pay attention to the truth instead of falling for the fiction. But I think the second aim is friction. So this is making it difficult for Vladimir Putin to focus on his game, because of course he's a former KGB guy. And as I've been saying, you can imagine he's stewing in his juices to try to figure out, how do the allies know what they know? Who can I trust? What technical systems have been breached? What can and can't I trust? And that's a page out of the playbook of US Cyber Command. The strategy is create friction for an adversary. The more they're playing defense, the more they're worried about what's happening, the less damage they can do, the more they're off their A game. And then the third goal, I think, is really to force countries to take a side. That revealing intelligence removes the fig leaf excuse that adversaries provide. So China's being backed into a corner. Nobody believes, or very few people believe, the Putin narrative outside of Russia. And China can't get away with, we hope, can't get away, it's harder to get away with saying that they're staying neutral. And so you see the Biden administration revealing intelligence about what the Chinese knew too, not just what the Russians were doing.
Right.
That Chinese leaders knew what was happening before the Olympics, and that they've been getting requests for weapons and other things. And that's deliberate too, that revelation of intelligence.
I'm going to improvise here and bring in one of our viewers' questions. Even though I have a plan, we're going to shift. Tarby Bryant of the World Affairs Council of Las Vegas and formerly World Affairs Council of Atlanta asks, and this is why we're segueing, is the US intelligence network equal to Russia's and or China's?
It's such a great question. I'm going to give a very unsatisfying answer, which is next book project. So this book looks at US intelligence. It's a
7.
great question about the comparative perspective. What I can say is I think there's some things that we're really good at. We're really good at technical intelligence collection. And there are some things where we're facing real challenges because of adversaries like China, and that is human intelligence collection. So one of the things we know with the techno surveillance state that is China today, think about all those cameras on the street corners. It's a lot harder to recruit human assets on the ground in Beijing because the Chinese Communist Party is watching everything they do. So in that surveillance kind of state, and they're exporting their surveillance technology, it's creating denied territories, or territories where it's much harder to recruit those human assets and meet with them on the ground. So I'd say in that respect, the Chinese really have an upper hand for now, but I never count the Americans out when it comes to human intelligence.
Very good. We'll come back to human intelligence in a minute, but Amy, at this point, I got to say, we don't usually get into the author that much, but it is related to your subject and how open you are, I think. Nancy Williams of the World Affairs Council of Rochester would like to understand your personal experience within the intelligence world, and have you ever worked for the CIA? And I just want to hint at your intro where you use the word visitor but not inhabitant.
Yes, I really appreciate that question. It's an unusual field to go into. And what I talk about in the book is I feel like an anthropologist. I'm an outsider. I've never worked in the CIA before. And I joke that I feel like I'm a visitor to a foreign land with a rare and secret clan of people called intelligence officers. And so my career has been trying to understand what's going on from the outside. And there are challenges and benefits associated with that. I can't know the full classified record. So I often hear from folks inside the intelligence agencies, if only you knew what we knew. And my answer is, well, then you should declassify a lot more. But the benefit of being an outsider is that I can ask uncomfortable questions, and I can take an independent stand and criticize these agencies, as well as find ways to try to improve them from the outside. So that fresh perspective, I think, can be an advantage in this line of work. But it's a interesting and challenging line of work when public affairs officers, and I've met with some, won't even tell me their last name, right? That's how much secrecy is ingrained inside some of these agencies.
But they are becoming more engaged with the general public. I want to get to that, but from Nick Remish of Lake Forest, what influenced you to get involved with the intelligence community in the ways that you have, and which aspects of your work do you find underappreciated?
Ooh, that's a great question. I stumbled into intelligence by accident. Like most people, I grew up on spy-themed entertainment, and I thought it was really interesting. But I ended up starting to study the US intelligence community in the 90s, when no one thought it was important because it was the peace dividend. And I did it by accident. I wanted to write my doctoral dissertation on the National Security Council. I'd worked, as you mentioned, on the NSC staff, and I thought, I'm going to write a history of the National Security Council. I came back to Stanford and I told my doctoral advisor, a woman by the name of Condi Rice, what my plan was. And she said, in a very nice way, but here's what I heard: that's a terrible topic, Amy. You have more homework to do. You need to look at more agencies than just one. You need to understand cause and effect of different trajectories. So I went back to the library, and I found that the CIA was created at the same time as the National Security Council. So it became one of my cases in my doctoral dissertation, and I was hooked. ever since, because I think the mission of intelligence agencies to try to anticipate what's going to happen in the future and work with policymakers to alert them to dangers in the world beyond. I find that mission endlessly fascinating. So I've been stuck on it now for almost 30 years.
Very good. And you have written some film criticism as well, in particular, one that I saw about Zero Dark 30, which you wrote in Foreign Policy, and talk about the image average Americans get from Hollywood, and to what extent our intelligence community is complicit in participating in that image making for good or bad, and where that leaves us to understand the several threats and the new landscape you've outlined today.
Well, Bill, the story starts actually at UCLA. So I used to be a professor at UCLA, and I was teaching a class on intelligence. And on a lark, I polled my students, and I asked them what they knew about intelligence and what their spy-themed entertainment viewing habits were. And lo and behold, what I found was, one thing wasn't surprising. They didn't know much about intelligence because it's hard to learn about intelligence, right? There aren't a lot of books out there. And what they did know, they got from the movies. And I found statistically significant effects of spy-themed entertainment on attitudes toward enhanced interrogation techniques, or what many regard as torture, so waterboarding, and other things like that. And so I followed the trail and did some national polls. I found the same thing. And then I looked at, well, does spy-themed entertainment influence real intelligence policy? And the answer I found was yes, because members of Congress, Supreme Court justices, cadets at West Point are watching the same spy-themed entertainment that all the rest of us are. And so I found a number of examples, disturbing examples of completely unrealistic fictional plot lines influencing interrogation techniques at Guantanamo Bay, influencing Supreme Court justices and how they would reason in court cases, and even influencing how the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence held confirmation hearings for Leon Panetta to be CIA director. And they asked him about a ticking time bomb scenario, which we see all the time in the movies and on TV, completely unrealistic. And they took this as a realistic thing and asked the CIA director nominee about it. So spy-themed entertainment isn't just entertainment. And Zero Dark 30, I think, is perhaps the most disturbing example of this. So when that movie came out, the acting director of the CIA, a man named Michael Morrell, who, full disclosure, I've co-authored something with, the acting director of the CIA had to write a memo to the entire CIA workforce, telling the workforce that this movie, which portrayed itself as based on firsthand accounts of actual events, it portrayed itself as a reported sort of documentary type film. He had to tell the workforce that it was not realistic. So when the head of the CIA has to tell the CIA that a movie about the CIA is fiction, not fact, you know entertainment isn't good entertainment.
Indeed. Indeed. I can appreciate that on one level. I have a younger brother, one of them, who's a former police detective, and the tidiness of police procedurals just doesn't bear any resemblance to the reality of the various paths that and trajectories of law enforcement. I want to talk a little bit. Why don't we set the table? If you know, this might be a good way to get the facts right. And I'm realizing that we've had some feedback from our audience that we got to start putting up some images from time to time during this cover to cover program, because you do have an excellent chart of the U.S. intelligence community as a bureaucracy. I don't have that for everybody now, apologies. But Amy, if you could talk about the bureaucracy, as well as sort of the day in a life of what and who does it, what gets done, and where do they swim? And is this bureaucracy we have, I think it's 18 agencies, am I right?
Yeah.
Is it too big? Does it serve our needs?
So it warms my heart that you like that chart. We spent so long trying to depict the 18 agencies of the US intelligence community in a way that was visually appealing and informative to the reader. Because with 18 agencies, it's hard to sort of figure out where they all fit, sort of who's who in the zoo. So most people know about the CIA. Many people would know about the National Security Agency, which collects and analyzes foreign signals intelligence. So think of making and breaking codes, foreign emails and telephone conversations and the like. But the rest of these agencies, I think most folks probably wouldn't know a whole lot about. So every branch of the military has an intelligence component to it. The FBI is an intelligence agency, but it's part of the Justice Department. The State Department has an intelligence unit that's small and mighty and has done amazing work serving the Secretary of State. And then we have sort of the behemoth intelligence agencies, all but the CIA really are part of the Pentagon. So why does this matter? Well, it matters because roughly 80% of the intelligence budget goes to agencies, intelligence agencies that really are part of the US Department of Defense. And what that means is they naturally tilt towards supporting the warfighter on the battlefield. Now that sounds great, but at what cost? The more you're supporting the warfighter in the battlefield, the less you can support strategic intelligence that asks what are threats over the horizon and how can policymakers think about those so we don't have to go to war. So the one important thing to understand about this behemoth system is that it tilts toward the tactical side rather than the strategic side. And that's an ongoing challenge. But Bill, you asked the question, do we have too many agencies or are we missing something? And my answer is we have too many and not enough. So what do I mean? 18 agencies is a lot to coordinate. There are reasons why we have 18. They specialize in different capabilities. They specialize with different customers. Intelligence for the Navy isn't the same thing as intelligence for the Army, for example. But what we saw with 9/11 was when you have that many organizations to coordinate, coordination becomes an even bigger challenge. And so it's a behemoth to coordinate. We have a relatively new director of national intelligence. It's a position created after 9/11. But we're missing one important thing in this 18 agency world. And that is an agency dedicated to open source or unclassified intelligence. What I argue in the book is this is the name of the game when it comes to insight. Think about what we can get on Twitter today. Think about what we can get from commercial satellites today. Think about all the people that are tracking nuclear threats that don't work for the US government. And secrets are always have primacy of place in secret agencies. And so open source intelligence is part of what these agencies do, but nobody gives it the priority that it needs. So I actually think we need another intelligence agency dedicated just to open source intelligence.
Well, at every point I've wanted to find time to ask you to give a concise sort of history, because that's a good part of your book. Is the subtitle is The History and Future of American Intelligence. And maybe this is that time where, in thinking about looking forward to an open source focused agency, we do have a question about let me get this straight. Is there a pathway for innovative tech entrepreneurs to present new ideas and solutions? So this is really maybe a briefer history, but how the private sector gets involved in the intelligence process, and it's much more so today. It's not a good history in many respects, but talk about how that may be a way forward.
So the private sector has to play a big role, not only in developing technologies that intelligence agencies can use, like AI, for example, but also technologies that the military can use. And so the concise history is in the Cold War, inventions really started in the government, and then, then they became commercialized. So the internet started in the government. GPS satellites started in the government. But now that process is reversed. Technological innovations are now starting in the private sector. And the challenge, whether you're an intelligence agency or a military unit, is how do we get that technology from the private sector into the government and scale it in a way that it's useful? And so AI in particular is something that intelligence agencies need to harness much more with their human analysts. And there are outreach efforts to be sure. There's a great venture capital organization by the intelligence community called InQtel, which invests in startup companies and has had some great successes. The Q stands for Q from the James Bond movies, by the way. So it influences what intelligence agencies do too. So there are efforts to do that, but we're nowhere near where we need to be to have more of a seamless flow from startup companies and new technologies into the intelligence community to help humans make better analyses of what's going on in the world.
Question from Phyllis Huster of Bellevue, Washington is it possible to have good AI algorithms powered by people aware and preventing bias or unfair targeting to fight bad AI?
It is. I mean, the AI is often sort of used like it's magic fairy dust. We'll sprinkle some AI and we'll get the answer. And I think this question points out something really important, which is AI is only as good as the assumptions and the data that go into it. So if you have biased data as going into the AI system, you're going to get biased algorithms. So AI systems are better at doing facial recognition of lighter skinned faces than darker skinned faces, which is why AI in the hands of law enforcement can be really problematic, right? Because you're misidentifying African-American suspects more frequently than you would lighter skinned suspects, for example. So it's really important to get the data right. And what that means for intelligence is AI is really good at some things. Pattern recognition of surface to air missile sites over large swaths of territory, right? An algorithm can do that 80 times faster than a human team. What is AI not good at? Small n or small data problems, questions about intention. Will Iran develop a nuclear weapon? The total number of countries that have experienced this is 10. No algorithm is going to give you the answer, right? Or help you understand, is Iran going to develop a nuclear weapon? Only one country in the world has ever given up its nuclear weapons, and that was South Africa for domestic political reasons. So AI is really good at some things.
Ukraine also.
If you could count Ukraine. Yeah, it's an unusual case, right? A former Soviet republic that, gave up its nuclear weapons.
Was the number 3 nuclear power briefly.
Right. With a lot of nucleir weapons.
And Absolutely. Good cred for doing so.
Yeah, you're right.
Sorry to interrupt.
You're right.
So with all this new technology coming, let's go back to the question posed by Joni Rice and others. Can you comment on the pervasive demand for human intelligence and the value it has going forward? Can you, and I would ask, can you relate that to certain current situations? Like, what is China going to do vis-a-vis Taiwan? Who's thinking about that? And what humans do we have trying to track that?
There's always going to be demand for human intelligence because images and intercepts and all the technical tools we have will only tell you so much. And that human intelligence, what is a leader thinking? What are their weaknesses? What are their vulnerabilities? Who's in the inner circle? That's just invaluable. And so we saw this with respect to Russia's election interference in the 2016 presidential election. You might remember that there was an intelligence assessment that was declassified that said they concluded with high confidence that it was directed by the Kremlin. How do we know that? We know it's been publicly reported because we had a human source in the inner circle. And that human source had to be exfiltrated from Russia. And so I think one of the remarkable things today with respect to Russia and Ukraine is that it appears we still have good human sources, if not in the inner circle, with enough insight into providing some streams for US intelligence agencies. So that human piece is always going to matter because it gets at those interpersonal dynamics and what intentions might be.
I can think of 2 other human pieces: counterintelligence and traitors. And could you talk about how maybe this is being transformed in this era also, if at all?
So I think technology is transforming everything, and it's including transforming counterintelligence and how we think about traders and the damage they can do. And so, as with most things with technology, the big difference is speed and scale. So, when we think about traders in history, it took a long time for them to ferret out documents. They literally had to bring them out in garbage bags or hidden in their pants, sort of one document at a time. But fast forward to today, a Chelsea Manning or an Edward Snowden can download thousands and even millions of pages of documents in a very short period of time. Speed and scale of damage of one insider who decides they want to betray their oath to their country to protect national security information can be devastating. So breaches are more significant now, and the scale of damage is bigger. The other challenge is technology can enable foreign intelligence services to penetrate our networks. This is what's happened in China. So our network of human assets on the ground in Beijing over the past several years, it was, in the past decade, was blown. Many of them were executed, many were imprisoned. This has all been publicly reported. And the most likely explanation is we had a weakness in our communication system, our technological communication system, and the Chinese were able to penetrate that weakness electronically and uncover who was who among our assets. So it poses real challenges in terms of how you recruit people, how you protect information, both sides of the counterintelligence coin.
Talk about the hit. Let's go into a history this way too. The history of failure as like big failures, turning points, because you cover really from George Washington all the way to today. But modern era comes from the interwar period on, and accelerates with the US's rise to globalism. Talk about Pearl Harbor and through 9/11 and beyond.
So failure has catapulted major changes in our intelligence system since Pearl Harbor, really. So the reason we have a CIA was to prevent another Pearl Harbor. The big so what of the Pearl Harbor attack was that clues of Japan's intentions were present in a number of different intelligence units that already existed, but there was no one place where they were all brought together. There was no central intelligence agency. That's where the CIA got its name. And so the idea was we had to create something that would harness all of this intelligence and coordinate across the community. Then after 9/11, what we found was that even the CIA couldn't do that job very well. So the CIA director for more than 50 years had two jobs. One was running the CIA, and the other was coordinating everybody else. And that position never had the heft to do both of those jobs well. So the two things you need in Washington to sort of knock bureaucratic heads together are power over budgets and power over people. The CIA director never had those for organizations outside the CIA. By the way, the current director of national intelligence doesn't really have those tools either. And so that's an ongoing struggle. But whenever there's a disaster or failure, the natural inclination is to create another agency. And we've seen this play out over the past half century.
I want to remind people that we are talking with Dr. Amy Zegart of Stanford University, and also a professor there and author of Spies, Lies, and Algorithms. I had trouble reading algorithms in reverse. That's why I paused at the top. I wanted to mention that one of our viewers picked up on the chart that you provided of our intelligence bureaucracy. It's on page 73, folks. You need to buy this book, and you can find all about that and more. And we have an update that I'm wanting to share without having people leave the program, but live on CNN, I'm told by a viewer, Madeleine Albright, former US Secretary of State, has passed away at age 84. Amy, you may have had some encounters with Secretary Albright. I did in Boston when I was hosting her for a gala dinner. Perhaps you'd like to comment on her professionalism and how she worked. doggedly to represent the United States and how she collaborated with our intelligence community.
Well, it's a very sad bit of news to hear of her passing. She was a true patriot. She worked, as you said, across the aisle through her whole career. She was a trailblazer as the first woman Secretary of State. She worked really well with people from all different countries and all different backgrounds. And I will share a story. Many people may not know Madeleine Albright's father was a professor, Joseph Corbell, and her father was Condi Rice's dissertation advisor. And so you think two women secretaries of state worked in different administrations, very close to the same man, very close with each other. And Madeleine Albright once joked that she could never understand how Condi could become a Republican because they had the same dad.
How did that happen?
So, just a true pillar of statesmanship,
Indeed.
of service, of bipartisanship, really the best of America. We've lost a towering figure today.
Indeed. Indeed. We have someone who worked very closely with her over the years as the head of the CIA now, Bill Burns. What do you think a former diplomat, career diplomat like Director Burns how he thinks about our most notable spy agency and how it should function? And what freedom does he have, someone who's had deep experience with Moscow, for example, about accessing intelligence, say about the Ukraine conflict. Also, he had a mission to Afghanistan before the withdrawal of troops. Talk about his leadership.
So I think we're very fortunate to have Bill Burns leading the CIA in particular at this moment in time. As you mentioned, he's a Russia expert. He spent years in the country, including as ambassador to Russia. He knows Putin personally. He knows the country well. And his background as a diplomat is very unusual as CIA director. And I suspect it's one of the reasons why we've seen such an effective use of intelligence in diplomacy. So, I don't think it's a coincidence that we've had an incredible coming together of our allies, not just in Europe, but in Asia as well. And it's related to the intelligence disclosures that we talked about. I think Bill Burns really understands the value of sharing information, not just collecting information. And I think he's been very public about what he's doing with the agency, what his priorities are. And I think that's helped too. It's helped prepare some of the morale after the past several years. And it's helped, and it's really important for secret agencies in democracy to have the trust of the people. And I think with his forward-leaning approach and sharing what the agency is doing to the extent that he can, I think it's helped to provide that trust that is essential for our agencies to operate.
You you mentioned earlier that we're often tactically focused. The World Affairs Councils of America had the good fortune of bringing our chairman's circle, known as the 1918 Society, to the Central Intelligence Agency's campus. And we were given the tour that public people can have, and also sat down with people whose names were not given, but who were part of the super long-term analysis group, like 30, 50 years out, and looking at things like how climate will intersect with conflict and space as a domain and so forth. How valuable is that long-term strategic thinking for an agency that also produces the president's daily brief?
Right. So you have to be able to do both. And I think that long-term thinking is essential. And Mike Hayden, former CIA director, talked about this notably in his confirmation hearing years ago. And he said, unless we set aside time and talent to think about the long term, we will be endlessly surprised. And surprises are never a good thing in international affairs. And I think he's right. And that long-term thinking, the goal isn't to predict the future with pinpoint accuracy. It's to identify the drivers, the trends that are shaping global economics and politics and civil society. And if you understand the drivers, you can better anticipate when things are starting to happen, where they might go, and how we can kind of mitigate those downside possibilities. So understanding what's driving geopolitics in particular is essential for intelligence.
Certainly, China is our great geopolitical rival of the century, it would appear, not to diminish Russia's threat, but a question from Shannon Zink of WAC, World Affairs Council Greater Houston, asks, is China using activated spies in the US to spy on average Americans in our houses? If yes, why? And there are a lot of questions we've had around the issue of privacy.
So I don't know the answer to that. I mean, what I can say is that we do know from what's been, again, publicly reported, that China is the most active foreign intelligence service targeting the United States, right? Targeting universities, targeting corporations, targeting government officials, trying to buy and spy its way to technological advantage in particular. So the FBI director, Chris Wray, has said that the FBI is opening a China-related counterintelligence investigation every 12 hours, right? This is by far the greatest intelligence challenge to the United States in terms of their activities in the US. What exactly Chinese intelligence officers are doing, I couldn't say. But it's a serious challenge. It's a serious threat. But on the other hand, we've also seen the FBI overreacting with this China initiative that so far has really caused a lot of consternation, has been ended by the Biden administration, sort of targeting Chinese American academics and others. And so we have to proceed carefully, that we don't move to a world where we're suspicious and xenophobic about Chinese nationals studying in the United States, Chinese Americans, but we also can't be naive about what the Chinese Communist Party and the Chinese government is trying to do. And so we need to find a balance between those two.
What happens on the Stanford University campus with respect to convening? I think Catherine Stoner's there and Michael McFaul, and these are people who have spent careers involved with Russia, for example. How does a university, or for that matter, a nonprofit like World Affairs Councils of America, convene, I don't want to say sympathetically or apologetically for Russia or China, but to allow for perspectives from those countries, even as they're adversarial?
It's such a tough question, especially when you think about the disinformation machines that these two countries in particular have become. So you can see this with tech platforms too. Do we allow Russia Today, which is a propaganda machine? Make no mistake, it's not an independent media organization. Do we allow Russia Today to operate on our platform, grappling with those challenges? So I think universities are looking at how can we have diverse perspectives, but with respect to Russia and Ukraine, for example, I don't think there's a lot of appetite for hearing the Russian perspective right now. So I think, my colleagues, you mentioned Catherine and Mike, great friends of mine, we hosted President Zelensky from Ukraine just last year at Stanford. So there are some moments in history where you have to take a side, and it's clear that the side is on democracy. And so at least with respect to this particular issue, I can understand why we don't have panels where we have the Russian perspective of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. But it's important for us to think about hearing alternative points of view, generally speaking.
And it's important, I think, that we hear knowledgeable people talk about the situation of Russian opposition politics or protesters and what might be happening to them and what we can draw from history. But
and I think, Bill, what you mentioned, it's important to emphasize this, is distinguishing between the governments of these countries and the people of these countries.
Absolutely. Um, you have a nicely phrased chapter, Nuclear Sleuths in a Google Earth World. Talk about how intelligence is so relevant when it comes to the fact that we are facing more than we thought we would be today, real nuclear threats, and also the individual element of that you mentioned at the top, where just about anybody can participate in the sleuthing using modern tools. And then after that, you're in the Silicon Valley area. Really, what is the picture of big tech on this?
Big questions. So let me start with the nuclear sleuth. So I spent 2 years on that one chapter of the book. And it started with a hallway conversation where a colleague of mine named Scott Sagan, who's a nuclear expert, asked if I would contribute to a project he was doing looking at how well intelligence agencies had assessed nuclear threats in the past. And I thought, well, why don't I look at how well, in general, people are assessing nuclear threats today and in the future? And it turns out that one of the sort of leading groups of people that are using publicly available intelligence to track nuclear threats in North Korea and elsewhere is in down the hall from me in my building at Stanford. So colleagues of mine at Stanford. And so what I found in this 2-year project was this fascinating ecosystem of non-governmental people. Some of them are experts, some of them are hobbyists, some of them want to make money. They come with a range of motives and expertise, but they're transforming how we think about nuclear threats. So my colleague down the hall, Sig Hecker, is a nuclear physicist, used to be the head of Los Alamos National Lab. Sig, for most of his career, had a high-level security clearance. He is finding some of the most important unclassified information and providing it to the government and others about North Korea's nuclear program, using commercial satellites and all sorts of other tools. So this is a new world, and it's an ecosystem with different dynamics. So anybody can join, and that's good and bad. It means that errors can go viral. There's no quality control. There's no bureaucracy that has standard procedures to vet information before it gets out. And so one concern is that the risks are that bad information can go viral. We've already seen this happen before. That intelligence agencies have to expend an inordinate amount of time debunking bad claims instead of doing their day jobs. And that crises can actually be harder to manage when so much is transparent. So we think that transparency is always good and speed is a benefit. But when you're talking about crisis management, you often want secrecy to be able to negotiate compromise. And you often want time to think so that you can deliberate on the best course of action. So there are benefits to this emerging world, and there are risks to this emerging world. And so I'm going to be doing a workshop here in a few weeks about how can this ecosystem in nuclear security, how can it develop ethics? How can it develop quality control measures? How can it train itself so that we can harness all the benefits of this emerging world and mitigate some of the risks?
Is that workshop for your students, or is it faculty to faculty, or?
It's a workshop of mostly leaders in this world, but if anything I do at Stanford, I always like to have students involved because they often have the best ideas and they're the leaders of tomorrow. So I'm sure there will be students involved in that workshop.
I'm wondering, you mentioned being inspired by your mentor, Condi Rice, how your students are responding to you and your latest book. And they have choices. I mean, the public sector does not pay what the private sector does, but are they seeing opportunities in this field?
Absolutely. You know, I think this generation gets a bad rap that they don't care about service and they don't care about the government. What I find is this generation cares a lot about impact, and they want to go where they feel they can make a difference. And so if the government communicates the message well enough, right, that you can make a difference in the world, they'll sign up. And so I'm teaching a course based on the book starting next week.
Mhm.
And one of my goals in teaching this class is I don't want to have just the usual suspects, political scientists like me in the classroom. I want engineers in that classroom.
Oh,
I want computer science students who have never thought about international security before. Because if they take just a little bit of that class with them, wherever they go, whether it's to a company or a startup or to government, we will have people who are better positioned to make good decisions to help our nation. And so rather than thinking they have to go into government, I want them to take a little bit of that government perspective with them wherever they go.
well, let's turn to one aspect of governance. World Affairs Councils, we are the people. We elect representatives. We learn to make good decisions. At least we strive to inspire that. How good a job has Congress done? I don't know if you're bringing politicians to your campus, but how good a job, or describe the arc of congressional oversight, if you will. You have a good chapter on that.
Well, thank you. Congressional oversight is very frustrating. Let me start by saying there are some members of Congress that care a lot and do a very good job, but Congress as a whole has done a terrible job.
And it's
at
unsung electorally.
and that's why, right? So it's an electoral loser for members of Congress to devote all that time and attention to overseeing our intelligence agencies. They can't talk about what they do. They can't send pork back to the district. They can't send jobs. Voters don't care. I have spent my career looking at intelligence, and even I don't vote for my representative based on how they view the US intelligence community. And so they don't have the incentive to devote the kind of time to making sure that our agencies are effective, not just that they're accountable. We have to have both accountability and efficacy. And so what I found in the book, and I have all sorts of data behind this, is that the typical narrative is oversight comes and goes depending on who's in charge. But what I find is the general pattern is oversight has always been poor, no matter who is president, no matter who controls the Congress. And there are reasons why that is, and it has to do with incentives.
I want to get specific on this. One of your representatives, Senator Feinstein, had a really important role in the report that came out on the use of torture. And forgive me for forgetting, please share the Republican counterpart on that if you can. But did that reveal enough to the public, and did it have an effect on our intelligence community to change practice? How difficult is it? And this is like this, we're talking about core values. How difficult is it to actually change what whether it's torture, covert action, use of drones? How does this stuff get changed?
I think what we've seen actually is that policies do get changed. And they get changed in response to what the American people want. So when we think about the NSA's warrantless wiretapping program, the bulk collection of phone records, not content, I should hasten to add, but phone records. When the American public found out about it, Congress changed the law, and that program was ended. So that was an example of the oversight system eventually working. Right. With respect to Senator Feinstein's study, she and I have had a back and forth about this. I thought it was a very noble idea that was hobbled by poor implementation. Yes, we need to have a clear record about what happened, why it happened. And yes, we need to think about what our values are and make sure that our interrogation techniques are in accord with those values. But that study, and I would encourage people not just to read the study, which is the redacted version of it, summary version, is 600 pages long. There is a Republican dissenting study that's important to read too. And there's a CIA rebuttal to that study that's also important to read. It's complicated. And so what happened with that study is it started off as a bipartisan effort. And the Senate has been remarkably bipartisan even today with our polarized world in a whole host of intelligence issues. It began as a bipartisan effort. But here's what happened. Almost all the Republicans but one left that investigation because they were concerned that not one person was interviewed. So we talked about how important it is to have human intelligence and understand what the context and what's really going on. That investigation never interviewed a single person. And what it did was it made assertions about morality, which is important, but cloaked them as efficacy, that it didn't work or it didn't get information. And maybe that's true, but we don't know. We really just don't know. And so I think the report could have been so much more powerful than it was if they had had public hearings, if they had interviewed people, if they had been more analytically rigorous about what they were doing. So I think it was a kind of a Greek tragedy, that report. And what we found is it didn't actually change that much. People who were anti those techniques from the beginning are still anti those techniques. And the intelligence community felt persecuted by a report that didn't seem to be taking the full record into account and what the conditions were at the time. And I say this as someone who is absolutely opposed to those techniques. I think they're not efficacious and I think they are not moral. But I still think that the process of that report was a huge missed opportunity for the country.
I really appreciate those remarks. What keeps you awake at night? That classic question. What is the most threatening thing in your mind facing the United States today or the world?
The most threatening thing facing us is us. It's the erosion of our democracy. I think about, I tend to look at foreign threats and the rise of China and Russia and terrorism, but I think we can tackle any of those challenges if we are a country that has shared values. And I really worry about the unraveling of our democratic foundations, about the polarization of our society, about the deception and the false narratives, even related to the 2020 presidential election. And so we have to get our own democratic house in order. That's what keeps me up at night.
Very good. And that question was from Rich Miskowitz. Thank you very much. Thanks to everyone in the audience who asked questions and who joined us for this session of Cover to Cover.